Recording now. So,
I'm
Jeffrey Deskovich, just sorry, I should introduce yourself and essentially give us a bit of a understanding of what happened to you.
Yeah, I'm Jeffrey Deskovic, and I got arrested when I was 16 years old for a murder and rape, which I did not commit. I turned 17 by the time the trial rolled around, and where despite a pre-trial negative DNA exclusion, I was nonetheless wrongfully convicted of a murder and rape based upon a coerced false confession, prosecutorial misconduct, fraud by the medical examiner, terrible public defender. I lost 7 appeals. I got turned down for parole. Ultimately, I was exonerated by further DNA testing via the DNA data bank, which not only reaffirmed my innocence, but also identified the actual perpetrator. So all of my charges were dismissed on actual innocence grounds, whereas he was arrested and convicted of the crime. Left free while I was doing time for his crime. He killed a second victim 3.5 years later after killing the victim in my case. In terms of who I am, I'm an advocate. My mission in life is to fight wrongful conviction. I was an individual advocate for 5 years, and then I started the organization called the Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation for Justice, whose purpose is to free wrongfully convicted people and pursue policy changes aimed at preventing wrongful conviction. So to quickly sum up, we've been able to free 8 people. We've been able to pass 3 additional laws. Then working within a bigger coalition called It Could Happen to You, we were able to pass 3 additional laws. I have a master's degree. My thesis is on wrongful conviction causes and reform. So my knowledge base is not only on my experience, but also formal education. And as of October 26th, I got admitted to the bar. So I graduated law school last year. I passed the bar exam, and I'm now an attorney as well.
So, you've had a pretty complete life.
Yes, I have. I packed a lot into my 14 years of freedom, but I'm trying to make, I'm trying to make, I'm trying to make what happened to me count, and make an impact to make a difference.
You mentioned that the DNA didn't match you from the very beginning, yet they still pursued you. Why?
I think they just wanted to satisfy the public that they got somebody. That was part of it, and I think that they wanted to cover up. They wanted to look out. The prosecutor wanted to look out for the police because if they would have dismissed the case against me, the police's actions would have come under scrutiny. Like exactly what did they do in order to get a confession from an innocent person?
Okay. You mentioned that you had 7 appeals unsuccessful. Eventually, the DNA database, or data bank as you call it, identified not only that you didn't do it, but that it identified the likely perpetrator, and he was subsequently tried and convicted. And as you said, he had actually committed a murder while you were in prison for his crime. What sentence did he get compared to you?
He
For the
he
same
got a
crime, I
20.
mean.
Yes. I was given a 15 to life sentence, out of which I did 16, and he got a 20 to life sentence.
So he got longer simply because he was older when he faced trial, or is there any other reason he got 20 years as opposed to the 16 you got?
Yeah, well, remember, I was sentenced to 15 to life, not 16. What that meant is that I went to the parole board after that, and they declined to release me. He pled guilty. He didn't go to trial. He pled guilty. I guess that was the offer that the prosecution made. I think the fact that he remained silent while I was doing time for his crime, I think that was a factor in why the district attorney offered the plea bargain extended to him, which he took, was longer than my sentence.
Well, you say it's longer than your sentence. How long did you actually serve in prison for a crime you did not commit?
16 years.
Right. So you actually did 16 years of hard prison time for a crime you didn't commit. And this guy gets sentenced to 20 years. So only 4 in addition is for what happened to you. How do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, I don't I don't feel it's enough time, frankly. I mean, I think the fact that he remained silent while an innocent person did did time for his crime should be considered to be an extreme aggravating circumstance that resulted in him getting more time. I mean, I think he should have gotten 25 years, is what I think. I mean, in general, when people commit murder, that they generally get in the United States, they generally in New York, they generally get a 25 to life sentence. So I think that that's what he should have gotten. You got to remember too that he killed two people as well. I mean, I think the fact that he killed, not only him staying quiet for my crime, but the fact that he killed two people rather than one, should
Mhm,
also have been a secondary factor which resulted in the 25. I don't think he should have gotten the break.
mhm. There's a very similar case that I've been working on for a very, very long time. That is what the anniversary, 30th anniversary discussions are going to be about. One of the things that happened in that particular case is it's a gross miscarriage of justice on any way you look at it, but it's even more gross, if I can put it like that, because the innocent people, the Cardiff Five, three of them were convicted, and two of them received longer tariffs, which is the time you've got to serve before you can apply for parole, than the truly guilty for the same crime. How do you feel about that?
But that's an outrage. That's more injustice. That's adding injustice to injustice.
What's happened subsequently is behind closed doors, there was a parole hearing earlier this year. He was refused, this is the real murderer, was refused parole, but they told him they are recommending that he be moved to open prison. That is essentially the lowest category prison you can get, and it's essentially a preparation for release. He's now been moved during the coronavirus pandemic when people couldn't really do much about it to open prison, or at least the decision has been approved by the Minister of Justice. It means it's likely that he is going to be released at the next parole hearing without the public having the right previously to say, we don't agree. We think this man should have been given a much longer tariff, and we don't believe it is safe to release him. What do you think on that? What would, if you were in charge of dealing with this, or were you had a client who had been through this as an innocent person, as you indeed have, what rights do you believe they should have to oppose uh, the release on parole, or basically take legal action if there is any available?
Well, a lot of in a lot of states, like in the U.S., the victim has is able to give a state victim impact statement at the sentencing, and they're allowed to they can send a letter to the parole board. But honestly, I think that it's up to the judge to sentence. It's not. It should. I don't believe it should be up to the victim of the crime or as a
Mhm,
society, because then you start getting into mob rule. And really,
mhm,
in terms of when somebody is released, I mean, that's supposed to be decided by the parole board, which decides whether or not somebody can has demonstrated innocence and rehabilitation. It's not like a do over to decide
mhm,
if you think somebody got sentencing. So I mean, somebody
mhm,
expressing a passionate view that they don't want somebody released because they're still hurt from the grievous wrong conducted on them in the first place. I mean, I don't think that that has anything to do with rehabilitation. And I think that it leads
mhm.
to a devaluing of lives because just because one crime victim has people to speak up for them and then other people don't, so some people are let go early and others are not. I don't think that that values the human life equally.
What I was referring to was a situation like yours, where a person is an innocent victim of a miscarriage of justice, and the real perpetrator has then been brought to justice, but their victimhood, i.e., yours and that of the Cardiff Five, isn't properly taken into account in the determination of what the appropriate tariff should be. For example, you mentioned victim impact statements. They weren't even given the opportunity to give a victim impact statement. When it was accepted, their lives had been ruined.
Oh well, that's it. No, so on that issue, I completely agree that they should have been heard out. They have just as much right to make a victim impact statement as the crime victim family members are. Because look, we are victims. Innocent people who are imprisoned are victims of criminals who have committed crimes. But we're also victims of the authority figures that perpetrated those. I mean, most of the time in these cases, it is not a good faith error. And I feel like the justice system does not punish the people in law enforcement whose wrong actions lead to those unjust results.
Well, getting on to that, when the case was resolved with the conviction of the real killer, within days, the police announced the same police force, but it was different because they were the ones that actually reinvestigated and found the real perpetrator. They investigated what had gone wrong. They were allowed to talk to anybody, they could lay charges against anybody, but after 8 years, what happened in this particular investigation and cases, the only people who were tried and convicted of any offence in this particular case were three witnesses who the judge accepted had been basically bullied into making the statements that they would never have made under normal circumstances. He even said that this was conduct unbecoming in a civilized society. They went to jail, nobody else did.
That's unjust. That's unjust. The people who, the authorities that coerced them into making those statements, those are the people that should have been punished. If it was a different scenario where a civilian just comes out of left field and makes false statements on their own, like if they're trying to get back at somebody, for example, if a romantic relationship doesn't turn out well or some other motivation, and somebody initiates on their own false charges, then of course I agree they should be punished. But this scenario you're describing was not that. It was that the authorities coerced them. So I think it's an injustice that they got a punishment for that, and not the authorities that coerced them in the first place.
They did try and prosecute the certain police officers, but a complete hash was made of it. There were the disclosure obligations weren't conducted properly, and it became an absolute smokescreen because if you actually look at the early stage of this trial, it becomes very clear that the defense of the police officers who had done the original investigation was they were saying, we don't care what the DNA says, these people are still guilty. And they basically put a defense together which stretched credibility to absolutely absurd lengths. You basically have to believe that this poor woman was stabbed over 50 times in offensive stab wounds. It was an absolutely clear sexually motivated homicide. The case the police officers were trying to put forward is that there were two attacks. The real murderer went first, inflicted 10 or 12 stab wounds on her, which did not kill her and weren't that serious. And sorry, so they basically then had the Cardiff Five or somebody else came later, did all the nasty stab wounds, but they didn't leave a single trace of themselves. And his is all over the place. That is essentially what the police defense was. It really beggars belief that anybody could seriously believe this, but that was how they actually put their defense in the trial. What do you say about this? Because essentially, you also have to bear in mind what happened with this is the Cardiff Five were proved innocent by the conviction of the real killer. But when it comes to trial, there is no defense lawyer for them. They're not entitled to question the people accusing them of the murder again. There's no burden of proof in the attack on them, and the prosecution doesn't do their job properly. So essentially, the system says they had the right to be presumed innocent. What does the presumption of innocence mean if you can do that?
Yeah, it tramples on the presumption of innocence, and it certainly it re-victimizes them. That almost reminds me of my own case, though, in a way, because during the civil litigation where I was seeking compensation, the defense of two of the detectives from Peekskill, who had coerced a false confession out of me and fabricated other evidence, their defense, in a nutshell, for 5 years prior to them settling with me was Deskovic is guilty, and therefore we did nothing wrong. I remember there was a really telling exchange during the deposition. My lawyer asked them, "Well, you know that the DNA doesn't match, never matched my client from the beginning, right?" "Yes." "You know that the DNA did match another individual, right?" "Yes." "You know that that person was 27 years old, right?" "Yes." "You know that that person also confessed to the crime, right?" "Yes." "Do you have an explanation for how a 27-year-old's DNA ended up inside of the 15-year-old victim?" "No." "Do you still say that my client is guilty?" "Yes."
Well, that sounds absurd. And it's actually, again, they did this in the compensation case. The police tried to get compensation when the case against them collapsed, and they did the same thing. What I find particularly galling over this is that they claim this, but they refuse to say this outside of the protection of the courts. That you can say what you want in a case, and it is no it you report it can be reported, but you cannot be prosecuted for saying what you say in court. They refuse to say this outside of the court where you could actually take defamation proceedings against them. What do you think should be done in a case like this where you can essentially say whatever you want in court, however absurd it sounds, but you can get away with not saying it outside the court, and there's nothing the person effectively accused of murder all over again can do about it?
I think that it's very cowardly of the law enforcement to do that. They should have been willing to step. They really, they should have said that outside the courtroom, and that way they could have been sued. But the fact that they were not willing to do that, shows you that they didn't even really believe that themselves. So I think that when someone's been exonerated, if when there's an attempt to hold the officers accountable, and they start claiming that the person is guilty, that whether it's said inside of a courtroom or not, they should be subjected to a defamation of character lawsuit. They should.
There are a number of cases in the United States and all over the world where DNA testing has resulted in exonerations. Some of them are kind of dismissed in the same way they tried to with yours, in terms of saying just because their DNA isn't at the crime scene doesn't mean they didn't do it. And what kind of effect do you think this has had on public confidence where people are exonerated, but they leave this question mark over them, even though the evidence is pretty much saying it's very, very likely that they didn't do it. At the very least, it's saying that.
Yeah, I think that it's like you said, it's leaving a cloud of suspicion over their head, and that's it's damaging psychologically. There's a social stigma aspect of them. It's depriving them of justice, and there's a lot of other implications. It's easy to see how such aspersions, rather, excuse me, would interfere with trying to have normal relationships and getting hired for jobs, and it's disgracing stuff. It's dooming them to permanently pay for a wrongful conviction.
In your case, subsequently, they find the real perpetrator. So now it's moved from exoneration, where they can say, well, the DNA, it wasn't his, but it doesn't mean he didn't do it, to, well, now we actually know whose DNA it is, and there really isn't any kind of logical explanation for it other than this man is completely innocent and the other person is the one who committed the crime. So you've now moved from exoneration to vindication. What difference did it make when they kind of have to accept? Well, any normal person does, I'll put it like that.
No, it makes a tremendous difference. It makes a big difference. I mean, I didn't get an apology from any of the people originally involved in my case, and that bothers me. But I did at least get a symbolic apology from the judge who presided over the exoneration proceeding, and from the prosecutor who was in the court during that proceeding. And between that and then the actual perpetrator being arrested, and then plus there was a study done by four experts on what the district attorney's request, which outlined the way in which the system broke down to culminate into my wrongful arrest and wrongful conviction and preserving that. So for all those things, it made a huge difference. There was no dark cloud over me, and I know exonerees that other exonerees over here that I'm friends with, that because their exoneration didn't happen through DNA and they did have those aspersions cast on them, there is kind of a cloud over them, and it troubles them a great deal because the murders and rapes. I mean, these are who does that? I mean, it's
Mm.
really a heavy thing to have people think that you committed that crime and that you're home merely on some sort of technicality.
You knew you were innocent all along. There were people who did not believe you, and even after the DNA, the original DNA test excluded you, they still didn't believe you. How did you feel with these people? Did they come forward afterwards to you and say, Jeffrey, I'm sorry, I got it wrong? When you were, when there is all doubt was removed.
Well, that's what I'm saying. None of the people involved in my case ever apologized to me. They never did that. Again, the apology I got from the prosecutor, that was not the prosecutor who originally prosecuted me. The apology I got from the judge was not the judge that presided over that kangaroo court, which was unfair proceedings, which resulted in my being wrongfully convicted. And the district attorney herself who apologized, that was not the district attorney who was in office when I was wrongfully convicted. So the fact that I have never gotten an apology from any of the people directly involved, it still troubles me to this day.
Sorry, I didn't make myself clear. What I was talking about was people who said they were your friends, people who were your
Oh,
friends
yes, yes. Yeah,
earlier.
no, some of those people have come forward and have
Mm.
apologized to me. There's a type of collective guilt that they have. And even as to some of my family members, they've said things like, you know, uh, I'm sorry I didn't support you, that I didn't come visit you, or that, we weren't in written, we didn't write, we were not in phone communication. Um, they didn't help on the morale level. And there were different times when my mother went around to members of the family and asked everybody just to make a small contribution within their means so that we could hire an attorney, and that was refused, multiple times. So there is guilt on their end of it for that. And frankly, it took a while for me to overcome that. There were some awkward moments for sure. It was difficult to work out, but that's where I think that restorative justice and its principles, kick in. And I just want to mention, I do serve on the Global Advisory Council for Restorative Justice International. I do think that there is a definite crossover and application of restorative justice to people who are wrongfully imprisoned. I mean, just on the level of the actors, in the justice system, like we've talked about, them, the reconciliation and acknowledgement of doing something wrong and apologizing to the person being who was wrongfully imprisoned. I mean, I think that the victim family of the second victim that the criminal killed, I feel like the law enforcement who did what they did to me, they owe them an apology as well. Because if they would have done their
Mm.
job right, the second person wouldn't have been convicted. Sometimes that's the case with family members and the exonerees. So I had a memorable encounter with the victim's mother outside of the courtroom when the perpetrator was sentenced, and she hugged me and she was crying, and she they accepted my innocence, and it was really a healing moment for me. As was when I spent a couple weekends with them as their guest at their house, and I was able to share with them, why I had given the coerced false confession, and it was kind of a healing moment. So there's that level of it. And lastly, I think that there's a societal level. I mean, there are states where there's 15 states in the U.S., for example, that they don't give compensation. And I feel like, we need that in order to try to restore people. But even states that do, many of them are inadequate in terms of the amount of money that they give. Certainly, the immediate reentry help is needed, from housing to cost of living expenses to mental health services, doctor, dental care, access to public transportation, job training, job placement, classes on technology. I mean, that's lacking in almost every state. I don't know of any state over here in the U.S. that has that. And I know that that's also a problem internationally. I mean, there's some countries that they don't have a provision for compensating anybody, and I feel like all those things are necessary in order to restore the person who was victimized by the justice system, by the actors, and by the actual criminals. And without all of that, I feel like the process is incomplete.
On that note, aftercare and compensation are actually two different things. And you
Yes.
should be getting both because if you have been wronged in the way you and others who are clearly innocent because you've actually found the real perpetrator or you can prove there is no crime, even people who have been exonerated, because common sense is going to tell you a number of these people are absolutely clearly innocent and it should be dealt with, their compensation shouldn't have to include paying for their care, which effectively is what is being done.
Right. I agree with that. You're right. For example, I should receive mental health services, that the state pays for. I shouldn't have to spend any of the compensation I've been awarded to take care of my mental health needs. If the theory of compensation is to make somebody whole, to the extent that you can, then requiring them to spend some of that in order for their care for damages that originated from what happened to them, then that's the opposite direction. That's going to leave them incomplete.
Mhm. You had I was going to ask you this other part of it, in that you had this position where you're kind of in what I'll call innocence limbo, in that you've been exonerated, you're waiting to be vindicated. But all this time, even before it, you knew you were innocent. Then you finally prove it without doubt because they found the real perpetrator. Did you have a level of anger at various people that, well, you believe me now? Why? Why didn't you believe me before when the evidence was very clearly saying I didn't do it?
I did within the first week of my release, but what I found is that it nearly destroyed me, and I reached a point where I felt like I can't be angry or bitter anymore, and I got there through a few different lines of reasoning. First one is that, look, I feel like I've lost so much already. Why would I want to in effect give them the rest of my life? That's number one.
Mhm.
Another thing is that I recognize that I want to enjoy my life, whatever of it I have left, hopefully many years. you know um, I can't do that if I'm angry or bitter. It's another line of reasoning is it's not like I'm adversely affecting any of those people that did it to me if I was angry or bitter. And the vehicle that I utilize, which allows me to actualize that, is I take that energy that I feel, and I channel it into the advocacy work that I do, which consists of multimedia interviews, including new media and presentations around the country and
Mhm.
some internationally, meeting with elected officials, lobbying on behalf of legislation aimed at making the justice system more accurate, and also freeing people through my foundation.
Mhm.
So those things are all helpful, and honestly they're also healing and they're cathartic, and they help me get there. But the last quick point I want to make in connection with your question, Satish, is that I did I did my that first week when I did feel angry or bitter, it wasn't limited to the authorities. It was also limited. It was also included, rather, the media. When they let me into the courtroom, the bailiffs, they told me that, yeah, your family's on one side of the room and the media was on the left. I was looking for the media. I was looking for all of them. They crucified me in the newspaper. The prejudicial pretrial coverage, I feel like that definitely prejudiced the jury pool, and that was a factor in how, I was a factor in my being wrongfully imprisoned. And I did feel like, well, why are you all here now? And you realize you made the mistake, and so there was that level of it, and that to that extent, I think that the media has a role, in a lot of times in setting the stage for wrongful convictions to happen.
Mhm. You're quite unique as a victim of a miscarriage of justice in that you forgive very easily and very readily. Partly for yourself as well, because you actually recognize that it was going to damage you if you didn't. But you went further than this. You went to provide assistance. You used part of your compensation to help other victims of miscarriages of justice. You even went to law school and qualified so you could help represent these people. It's a very, very unusual story. Why did you react in that way? What motivated you to do all of that?
My my sense of wanting to prevent and help people, help prevent this from help happening to other people and helping that those who it does. I mean, everybody feels that to some extent, that at least verbally, to hear them have conversation with them or to read quotes from exonerees. But for me, I feel it ran even deep. My sense of that is very strong. It's stronger than most. Another thing is I've made sense of all this in a kaleidoscopic way. I believe that, my mission in life is to free wrongfully convicted people and, and prevent that. That's how I make sense of what happened to me in that. So there's those things. And then also, I feel like I've had educational opportunities that a lot of other people, haven't had. And, perhaps I was able to weather the psychological impact of what happened to me and a little bit better than some people have. And so I feel a large moral obligation to do everything that I can. I remember when I was imprisoned and I would read about other people being exonerated, and they would get an initial 5 minutes of fame, and then they disappear. You'd never hear from them again. And it always frustrated me. Like, why don't you help the rest of us? Why don't you take your moment of fame and talk about wrongful convictions in general, that there's more of us still inside here, and why don't you try to keep the media coverage going, and why don't you use this new platform and become an advocate? It always frustrated me that people were not doing that. And so when I found myself unexpectedly in the position of being exonerated, I thought to myself, well, you used to be critical of people, but now you're out here, so why don't you show them how it's done? So, I kind of drafted myself in that way, and that all of those things culminate into what you're saying, because you're right. People in this field, I mean, either you're an advocate or you're someone who's been wrongfully convicted. You're a professional in the field, or you're somebody who, this has happened to. You're generally not both, and I am both, and so in that way, you're right. I am unique that way.
You have represented 8 people that you have helped to get out of prison. How many more? I mean, are they involved with you as well now in your foundation? Do they help you to spread your message and investigate and do what needs to be done to help you present other people's cases?
Well, they don't investigate, but what they do, they're involved in the sense that if I need them to do like a media interview, or sometimes I call them up and say, look, we're going to our state's capital to meet with some legislators because we're championing one change in the law or another that's aimed at preventing wrongful conviction. And so some of them help me. They help me that way, but it's really these like cameo appearances here and there. They're not living, breathing this day in and day out on the same level that I am. And sometimes they tell me no, or I have to really push them, or okay, I give up on one person, I go and get a different person. So yeah,
Mm.
some of them do help me in that way.
One thing you and I slightly disagree on is you work on wrongfully convicted people, and that's fine. But you have a case like Cardiff 5, there are others, there's several others, where people were accused of crimes. They stood trial for these crimes. They were acquitted, and then subsequently, years later, but because they were just acquitted, they don't have an acknowledgement of innocence in any form, because it's like you weren't convicted, you were acquitted, because the law says that You have to be proved guilty beyond reasonable doubt. And an acquittal doesn't mean you're innocent. It means they didn't prove you. Obviously, it includes innocence. There will be innocent people in this, but what it says is we didn't prove the case against you beyond reasonable doubt. Then you get a situation, the same thing with the convicted. When they win an appeal, it is the conviction is unsafe and unsatisfactory. It doesn't necessarily say that the person is innocent. But you have a case like Cardiff 5 where you actually have both. You have people who were acquitted, you have people who were convicted, both wrongfully, and eventually they find the real perpetrator years later. For me, there is no difference between the innocence of the two acquitted men and the three convicted men, but two of them were never convicted, so they wouldn't qualify into, or would they, in terms of like, if they came to you and said, look, I'm equally innocent, but I'm getting a harder time because there's nothing there to say to recognize my innocence. What can you do to help me?
Yeah, well, look, I think, I mean, I know people. So Bill Basnick, actually, from the It Could Happen to You coalition that I work very closely with. I mean, he was acquitted, for example. He was never wrongfully convicted. He was acquitted after 2 hours. I mean, I certainly recognize Bill's innocence, and I do recognize innocence of people who were falsely accused and acquitted. And I do believe that they should be compensated as well, because they do, their reputations take a hit. Their life was there. It was psychological trauma that they were subjected to. They didn't know if they were going to prison. So I do think that there is a place for them. They lost wages, and their future impacted wages as well. So I do think that there definitely is a place for them to receive compensation. In terms of if somebody acquitted came to me and, well, I mean, we exonerate innocent people. I mean, in terms of them, bringing a compensation case. I mean, that's not something that the foundation does. We don't bring compensation cases even on behalf of people who are exonerated. I mean, that's a different area of law that's done afterwards. So yeah, I mean, there's not just, I mean, I get people who approach the foundation and that say, look, I've been falsely accused, and stuck with this public defender that really is overworked, and I don't feel is really all that diligent and doing much for me. Can you help? But we're not really equipped to do that. I mean, one of the reasons for that is, I mean, in a post-conviction case, there's plenty of material, that paperwork that's been, generated. There's been testimony, there's police reports, and there's a lot of documents that aren't necessarily available at the pre-conviction stage. So it's really hard to ferret out, legit claims from those that are not. I mean, even the foundation on the wrongful conviction end of it, we don't accept everybody's innocence claim. I mean, there's the people we've rejected that we thought were guilty. I mean, I'll give an example. Somebody, we they claimed that somebody planted, that they were renting a room in a house, and that somebody else in the house planted the guns that the police found there, which were, used in a robbery. And so when we asked, well, I understand that people had access to the room, but why would somebody leave, firearms out in the open where you could have come home and found it and then like called the cops? You want to explain that a little bit more? And their answer was, well, it was an unreasonable search. The police had no right to search the apartment, so it should have been excluded from the trial. And we want you to exclude that from your consideration too in deciding whether or not to take my case. So my point only in that sharing that story is that, we don't believe that everyone who claims that they're innocent are innocent. That's the point. But look, in the case of where some of the convictions is considered to be unsafe and vacated, which is a European thing. They don't have that in the U.S., although we should.
Okay.
I think that person is should be presumed and considered by everybody there should be a presumption of innocence there, which is, the law claims they're presumed to be innocent.
What if somebody came to you who'd been acquitted at trial, but
Hmm.
was still getting a hard time because people were saying, yeah, sure, you're innocent. Yeah, of course you are. Everyone says that. And they essentially say, look, I've had enough of this. It's driving me up the wall. I'm pretty sure I know how to solve this, but I need your help. Can you please help me by getting for example, getting the national DNA database checked? Because I'm pretty certain the real perpetrator's DNA is on there and this is going to prove it. Would you
Oh,
take such a
yeah,
case?
yes, that has never happened before. We've never been approached in that way. I'm not aware of any other organization ever being approached in that way. But if we were, we would do that. Sure. The more common scenario, and this happened with Kirk Bloodsworth, which is after Kirk was exonerated, years later, the DNA which excluded him was entered into the database. This is years after he was exonerated and freed. It was they took the DNA and they entered it into the database and matched the actual perpetrator. So that I have heard of happening, but that's a different scenario than what you asked. But I would do that, sure.
Uh, your
I just want to
work.
make a quick point on that. Just doing
Go ahead.
innocence work does not mean that we want the actual perpetrators to get away with their crimes. I mean, to the opposite. A lot of times exonerating somebody means proving the guilt of somebody. And I do consider myself that I was victimized. I'm a crime victim, not just by the authorities and what they did, but by the actual perpetrator and remaining silent while I did time for his crime.
Uh, it's approaching the 30th anniversary of the end of the Cardiff 5 trial. There's going to be, I'm helping to organize a large event to commemorate this and how it affects various jurisdictions, and you are going to be part of that. How important a case do you think that one is? And what do you think the lessons should be of cases like this, like your own as well, where they find the real perpetrator and that obviously proves innocence? What should happen with the criminal justice system so that they can turn around and say to you, look you in the eye and say, this is what we have done to make sure nobody else goes through what you went through? At least it will be accidental, that will happen. You cannot have a system where no miscarriage of justice will happen when humans are involved in it. What you can do is make it harder for it to happen deliberately. So what would you want to see as the lasting legacy of your case to prevent this from happening again?
I would like it to be studied and as many different lessons as can be extrapolated from it, should be. So like for example, in my case, it was coerced false confession. So I feel like videotaping the interrogation completely from beginning to end is a lesson. The particular care that it should be paid when interrogating a juvenile. Not allowing the prosecutors to argue things in court if they don't have a proper evidentiary foundation. So I think that every level, the actions of every actor, police, prosecutor, defense lawyer, and judges, everything should be analyzed. As many themes should be extrapolated from that as possible and turned into policy aimed at and laws and procedure in court to prevent the wrongful conviction from happening in the same way. I think that should happen, and I think that people should be compensated and helped to re-enter society. And we need to start holding authorities, prosecutors, and police accountable when they engage in clear-cut intentional misconduct. They should be going to prison. And this compensation that's paid out shouldn't just be limited to the authorities, the municipalities that they work for, but some of it should come from their personal pocket, the same way that if somebody committed murder, they would be subjected not only to criminal prosecution, but you could get a wrongful death lawsuit against them. And I think that the actual perpetrators of that should of the miscarriage of the authorities, they should have to pay something now, because right now everybody's getting away with something, and there should be a public apology by the highest officials that could be there. And there should be all the reentry services. And I think if you do all of that, then you've done as much as humanly possible. But the problem is that often very little to none of that happens, and so it's the ultimate injury then.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I just wanted to add that, wrongful conviction, it happened to me, and it could happen to you. I want to add that, it's, someone who's wealthy has, more access to resources, so they'll be able to hire experts and better lawyers. But other than that difference, I mean, I feel like wrongful conviction, it transcends socioeconomic status to some extent. It happens to people of different races as well. There is a racial bias. I mean, so for example, in America, um, it's an African American male is 7 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted of murder. They're 3.5 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted of sex offense cases. So there are racial disparities. But that being said, I'm pretty much as white as you can get. So it does transcend race. There is no one particular
Mm.
walk of life that this happens to. So we all have a stake in making the justice system as accurate as we can. Everybody should get involved. And again, I think the best way to think about wrongful convictions in the largest sense is it's a public safety issue. I remember some years ago that there was a New York Times study that said that in 25% of the exonerations that year, there was some level of police or prosecutorial um, involvement, some assistance. So I'd like to see, more of that. And we can't, amidst all the focus now on police reform, we can't forget about, the prosecutors and the critical role that they play in these injustices. And, while unjustifiable deadly police force and brutality are terrible, at the same time, engaging in what's called test-lying when they come to court and they lie, or they coerce false confessions, or they use lying informants, or they use identification procedures, or they bury evidence of innocence. It's all tied together in that it's all police misconduct. So I'd like wrongful conviction to not be left behind. And we got to think about the role of judges also. I mean, when you read these summaries of these wrongful conviction cases, whether it's books like yours, whether it's much shorter works like the summaries on the Innocence Project's website or the National Registry of Exoneration, there were plenty of red flags along the way, that there was something wrong. There was plenty of chances for the judges to step in and, and to stop these cases. I mean, judges aren't supposed to allow identifications in that are suggestive. They're not allowed to use, they're not supposed to let in statements or confessions that are involuntary or coerced, but they do. But they do,
Mhm.
and they don't correct it on the levels of appeal that happen afterwards. They don't correct them. And, we need the judges to be better as well. And if they're not going to be, we need to have some kind of way of getting rid of them and replacing them with other people. And I think maybe more training on what the cause of wrongful convictions are, what the warning signs are. I think that's part of it as well.